My name is Rachel Doyle. I was 28 years old, and 3 days before my wedding I believed my family had finally, after years of quiet distance, come back around to loving me the way I needed them to. I was wrong. The rehearsal dinner was held at the Baldwin Room, a rented event space attached to the Marriott off Route 9 in Poughkeepsie, New York, the kind of place with gold-trimmed chairs and a chandelier that was slightly too big for the ceiling. 42 people were there. My fiancé, Marcus Hale, stood near the head table in a navy suit he'd had tailored in Albany, laughing at something his best man said, his hand resting easy on the back of a chair like a man who had nothing left to worry about. I remember the smell of the rosemary chicken they were plating, and the sound of a fork tapping a wine glass somewhere near the bar, and my mother, Diane, crossing the room toward me with a look on her face I hadn't seen since I was 17, tied around the eyes. Rehearsed. She didn't hug me. She said, "Rachel, there's someone here who needs to speak with you," and stepped aside, and behind her stood a woman I had never seen in my life, holding the hand of a boy who looked about 6 years old, and the woman said, loud enough for the tables closest to us to turn, "I'm not doing this quietly anymore. Tell them whose son this is." The room didn't go silent all at once. It went silent in pieces, table by table, like a wave folding backward. Marcus's laugh died somewhere in his throat. His mother, Carol, set down her wine glass so hard I heard the stem crack against the table runner. And I stood there in a dress I hadn't even tried on yet for the wedding, in low heels because we were told rehearsal was casual, and I had absolutely no idea who this woman was. Before I tell you what happened next, and before I explain how a total stranger ended up standing in front of my future in-laws holding a child she claimed was mine, tell me, what time is it where you're watching this from? Where are you watching from? What's the weather like there tonight? I'm always curious how far a story like this ends up traveling. The woman's name, I would later learn, was Teresa Vance. She was 34. She said her son's name was Eli. And she said it again, this time looking directly at Marcus instead of me. Ask Rachel about November of 2019. Ask her about the coverage gap. Ask her why she disappeared for 4 months and came back different. I opened my mouth, and nothing came out, because the truth was I did not know what she was talking about, and in a room full of people who had known me my entire adult life, that silence looked exactly like guilt. My father, Gerald, didn't move from his seat. That was the detail that stayed with me longest, longer than Teresa's voice, longer than the crack of the wine glass. He didn't stand up to defend me. He didn't ask a single question. He looked down at his plate like a man waiting for a storm to pass over a house that wasn't his. Marcus's mother, Carol, was the first to speak once the room found its voice again. "Is this true?" she asked, not to Teresa, but to me, and I remember thinking, distantly, underneath the panic, that she hadn't asked if it was true, she had asked me to confirm it, which is a different question entirely. I said the only honest thing I had. I don't know this woman. I have never seen this child before in my life. Teresa didn't flinch. She reached into a canvas bag hanging off her shoulder and pulled out a manila folder, thin, maybe 6 or 7 pages inside, and set it on the head table between the floral centerpiece and Marcus's untouched glass of Cabernet. "There's a hospital discharge summary in there," she said. Vassar Brothers Medical Center. October 14, 2019. And a name that matches your maiden name and your date of birth. I didn't come here to ruin your wedding. I came here because your mother told me you'd deny it, and she was right, and I needed people to see your face when you did. My mother told her. Those 3 words did something to my chest that the rest of the room hadn't managed. I turned to look at Diane, and she was already looking away from me, toward the bar, toward anything that wasn't my eyes, and in that half-second turn I understood that whatever was happening had not started that night. It had started somewhere long before, in a place I hadn't been allowed to see, and I had walked into that ballroom 3 days before my wedding with absolutely no idea that the war had already been fought and lost without me. To understand why my mother would hand a stranger a folder meant to destroy me 3 days before my wedding, you have to understand what our family actually was underneath the version we showed people at Christmas. I grew up in a split-level house on Fairview Terrace in Hyde Park, New York, with my father Gerald working as a claims adjuster for 31 years at the same regional insurance office, and my mother Diane running the front desk at a pediatric dental practice 2 towns over. We were not rich. We were not poor. We were the kind of family that looked, from the outside, entirely unremarkable, and that was exactly the image my mother worked hardest to protect. I had one sibling, my younger brother Todd, 4 years behind me, and from the time I was maybe 11 years old, I understood without anyone explaining it that Todd was the child my parents had built their story around. He played travel baseball. He was, by every account my mother gave to anyone who would listen, destined for something big. I was the older one, the responsible one, the one who didn't need attention because I handled things myself, which is a phrase my mother used so often growing up that I used to think it was a compliment. It wasn't until I was 22, home for a weekend from my job in Albany, that I saw the pattern clearly for the first time. Todd had wrecked his car, a used Honda Civic my parents had co-signed for, driving drunk after a bar in Poughkeepsie, and instead of consequences, my father drove 40 minutes to pick him up before the police report was even filed, and my mother spent the next 2 weeks telling relatives that Todd had swerved to avoid a deer. I remember standing in the kitchen when she said it to my Aunt Pam on the phone, watching her rearrange the truth like it was furniture, and thinking, not for the first time, that whatever my mother decided the story was, that was the story that would exist. The specific incident that mattered most, though, happened in October of 2019, the exact month Teresa Vance would later hold up in that folder like a weapon. That October, I was 21, still living at home while finishing my associate's degree at Dutchess Community College, and I had a boyfriend at the time named Kevin Aldrich, a guy my parents never liked, mostly because he worked at a landscaping company and didn't come from a family my mother recognized at any of her church functions. In September of that year, I missed my period for the first time in my life, and in a panic, I took a home test that came back positive. I was terrified. I told my mother first, sitting on the edge of my bed, and I remember her face didn't change at all, which at the time I mistook for calm. What she did next, I only pieced together years later. She told me she'd take me to a women's health clinic in Fishkill for an ultrasound to confirm everything, and she did take me, on a Tuesday morning, October 8, 2019, and I remember the receptionist's name tag said Rehearsal. What I did not know, because I was told to wait outside the exam room for privacy protocols, was that the test result I'd been given had been a false positive, caught and corrected on the very same visit, and that my mother knew this before I left the building. She let me believe I was pregnant for 4 more months. I did not have a clean answer for why, even years later, sitting with a therapist trying to unpack it. My best guess, and it's only a guess, is that a pregnant, unmarried daughter with a landscaper boyfriend was a story my mother could use, a cautionary tale to keep Todd in line, a private shame she could hold over me quietly whenever she needed leverage, evidence that I was, despite appearances, exactly as reckless as she'd always suspected. I disappeared from most of my social life that fall. I gained anxiety weight. I broke up with Kevin in November, partly because I couldn't stand lying to him about something I didn't understand myself. And in February of 2020, at a follow-up appointment I insisted on because something felt wrong, a different doctor, a woman named Dr. Anita Cole, told me plainly that there was no pregnancy, that there never had been passed that first inconclusive test, and that whoever had told me otherwise for 4 months had either lied to me or lied to themselves. I confronted my mother that same week. She told me I must have misunderstood the doctor, and when I pushed harder, she told me I was always looking for a reason to make this family look bad, and that was the end of that conversation. I let it go, the way I let everything go, because that was the role I had been assigned since childhood, the one who handled things herself. I met Marcus Hale 18 months later, in June of 2021, at a mutual friend's barbecue in Rhinebeck. He was finishing his 2nd year as a physical therapist at a sports medicine clinic in Kingston, steady, unremarkable in the best way, the kind of man who called his mother every Sunday and meant it. When I told him, early on, that my family was complicated, he never pushed for details, which I mistook for respect and which was really just the absence of curiosity. I never told him about October of 2019, because as far as I understood it, there was nothing to tell. There had been no pregnancy. There had been no child. I had no idea my mother had spent 5 years turning that non-event into something else entirely, something with a name, a face, and a folder, and that she had been building toward the night she would set it down in front of everyone I loved. The wedding did not happen the next day. Marcus canceled it himself, standing in the parking lot of the Marriott at 11 that night, his tie loosened, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. He didn't yell. That was almost worse. He just said, "I need actual answers, Rachel," not a denial, and got into his car and drove back to his apartment in Kingston. And I stood there in the cold October air smelling exhaust and rosemary chicken and thinking that my entire future had just folded up like a lawn chair in the space of 90 minutes. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning with the manila folder Teresa Vance had left behind, because she had left it, deliberately, sliding it toward me as she walked out with Eli's small hand in hers, saying only, "I have my own paperwork. Keep that one." Inside were 7 pages. A hospital discharge summary from Vassar Brothers Medical Center dated October 14, 2019, listing a patient name that was close to mine but not exact, Rachel D. Doyle, middle initial wrong, date of birth off by 1 digit. A birth certificate for a boy named Eli Vance, born October 14, 2019, father listed as unknown. And a printed string of text messages, screenshotted, between a number saved as D and a number I didn't recognize, dated across several months in 2019, discussing a payment of $4,000. I called my mother at 6 the next morning. She didn't answer. I called again at 7, and again at 8, and at 8:40 she picked up and said, before I could speak, "You need to let this go, Rachel, for everyone's sake," which is when I understood, with total clarity, that she already knew exactly what was in that folder. I drove to my parents' house on Fairview Terrace that same morning. My father was at the kitchen table, still in his work clothes from the office, and he wouldn't look at me either, the same way he hadn't looked at me at the rehearsal dinner. My mother stood by the sink with her arms crossed and told me, in a voice I can only describe as clinically calm, that Teresa Vance was a troubled woman she'd tried to help, that the folder was mostly fabricated, and that I should focus on fixing things with Marcus instead of digging up things that don't matter. I asked her directly, "Who is D?" She said it could be anyone. I asked her to hand me her phone. She refused. That refusal is what changed everything for me, because up until that moment, some small, exhausted part of me had still been hoping this was a misunderstanding I could apologize my way out of. Instead, I drove to a UPS store on Route 44 that afternoon and had the folder scanned and saved to a flash drive, then drove straight to the office of an attorney named Priya Nanda Kumar, who a coworker had used for a landlord dispute the year before. I sat in her office in Poughkeepsie and told her everything, and she listened without interrupting once, which nobody in my family had ever done, and at the end she said something I wrote down in my phone that same day: "You don't need to prove your innocence to your family. You need to establish the facts, on paper, in case this follows you into your marriage, your job, or a courtroom." She recommended 2 things immediately. First, a paternity test request through Eli's mother, voluntary if possible, court-ordered if not. Second, formal records requests, hospital records from Vassar Brothers under my actual name and date of birth, to compare against the altered document Teresa had, and phone records if I could get them, though she was clear that would likely require a subpoena rather than a simple request. 10 days later, the hospital records came back. My real October 2019 visit showed exactly what Dr. Cole had told me in February 2020, an inconclusive initial test, followed by a corrected negative result recorded the same day, October 8, not October 14. There was no record of any hospital visit under my information on the 14th at all. Whoever had built Eli's paperwork had used a date close to mine and a name close to mine, but not mine. 3 days after that, a private investigator Priya recommended, a retired county detective named Walter Ostrowski, called me with something worse. He'd pulled public property and business records tied to Teresa Vance and found a payment history, not $4,000 once, but 4 separate payments of $1,000 each, wired between 2019 and 2021, from an account belonging to my mother, Diane Doyle, to an account belonging to Teresa Vance. I sat in my car outside Walter's office on Main Street in Poughkeepsie and read that number 4 times. $1,000. 4 times. Not hush money to make a scandal disappear. A subscription. My mother had been paying a woman for years to hold on to a story about a child that didn't belong to me, and she had done it not to protect me from something, but to keep a weapon loaded and ready, in case she ever needed it. The question I couldn't answer yet, the one that kept me awake for the next 3 nights, was why now? Why detonate it at my rehearsal dinner, in front of 42 people, 3 days before I was supposed to marry a man my mother had never once said she approved of? The answer came from a place I hadn't expected, my brother Todd. He called me 11 days after the rehearsal dinner, which was unusual on its own, because Todd and I texted maybe twice a year and spoke on the phone even less. He sounded different, tired in a way I'd never heard from him, and he asked to meet at a diner off Route 9, the Beacon Diner, not anywhere near our parents' house. We sat in a booth by the window, and he ordered coffee he didn't touch, and he told me something that rearranged the entire shape of what I thought I understood. Todd was $28,000 in debt, most of it from a failed attempt at opening a car detailing business in New Paltz 2 years earlier, plus credit cards he'd let spiral after that. He'd asked our parents for help in the spring, and my mother had agreed to give him $20,000 from her and my father's retirement account, but only, he said, after Marcus's parents, Carol and Richard Hale, had hosted an engagement dinner in June where Richard had mentioned, casually, that he and Carol intended to gift Marcus and me a down payment on a house as a wedding present, a figure Todd said he'd overheard as somewhere around $80,000. My mother, according to Todd, had become fixated on the idea that once I married into the Hale family, any financial trouble in our own family would look shameful by comparison, a poor relation embarrassing itself next to money. Todd said she'd told him directly, in August, if this wedding falls apart, at least it falls apart before people start comparing us. He said he hadn't understood what she meant until the rehearsal dinner itself. I asked him the only question that mattered. Did he know about Teresa Vance before that night? He looked out the window for a long moment before he answered. He said he'd overheard our mother on the phone in July, in the garage, using a tone he described as handling something, and he'd caught the words, "Just wait until the dinner, it'll matter more in front of people." He hadn't known what it meant. He said he assumed she was talking about seating arrangements. I believed him, mostly because Todd had never once in his life been clever enough to build a lie that specific. What Todd's account gave me wasn't proof for a courtroom, but it gave me motive, and Priya told me that mattered more than I realized, because it explained the timing in a way that would make sense to anyone hearing the full story later, a jury, a judge, or simply Marcus's parents. My mother hadn't unleashed Teresa Vance because new information had surfaced. She'd unleashed her deliberately, at the moment of maximum audience, because a private accusation could be denied, but a public one, delivered in front of the Hales, could not be walked back without permanently damaging me in front of the very family whose money and standing had become, in her mind, a threat to our own. 2 weeks after the diner conversation, Walter Ostrowski called with the paternity results. Teresa Vance had agreed to the test voluntarily, which surprised me until Priya pointed out that Teresa had likely been paid to deliver a performance, not to defend a lie under legal scrutiny forever. Once real documentation entered the picture, her incentive to keep protecting my mother collapsed. The results were unambiguous. I was excluded as Eli's biological mother with total certainty. The lab, Duchess Diagnostics, dated the report November 3rd, and Priya had it notarized and filed with a formal letter to accompany any future proceedings. That same week, Walter uncovered one more detail, the one that finally made the entire architecture of my mother's plan visible. Teresa Vance had worked, briefly, in 2018, at the same pediatric dental practice where my mother was the front desk manager. hired for 6 months as a hygienist's assistant before being let go over what personnel records called a billing discrepancy. My mother hadn't found a stranger to weaponize. She had found someone she already had leverage over, someone already financially unstable, someone who owed her, in Teresa's own words to Walter during his interview, a favor she couldn't really say no to. I read Walter's report twice, sitting alone in my apartment, and I remember the specific detail that broke something loose in my chest, not the money, not the fake documents, but a line from Teresa's interview where she told Walter that my mother had said to her, word for word, "Rachel will forgive me eventually. She always does." She wasn't wrong that I always had. She was wrong about eventually. I made the decision that week, sitting across from Priya's desk with Walter's full report between us, that I was done handling things myself in the way my mother had always meant it, quietly, privately, absorbing damage so the family surface stayed smooth. This time, I wanted a record. Not revenge. A record. Priya laid out the actual legal landscape for me clearly, because I'd gone in half expecting some dramatic lawsuit and instead got something far more precise. There were 3 separate tracks available. First, a civil claim against my mother for defamation, since Teresa's public statement at the rehearsal dinner had been false and damaging, and my mother had orchestrated it with documented payments as evidence of intent. Second, a possible fraud angle around the falsified hospital discharge summary, which Priya flagged for the Dutchess County District Attorney's Office rather than pursuing civilly, since forging a hospital document was a criminal matter, not just a family dispute. Third, and this one Priya said mattered most for my actual life, a formal, written record, affidavits, financial documentation, the paternity exclusion, Walter's investigative report, that I could present to Marcus and his parents directly, not as an argument, but as evidence. I chose to pursue the first and third tracks, and to let the DA's office decide independently whether the document forgery warranted charges. Priya said that combination gave me leverage without turning my family into a spectacle beyond what my mother had already made it. The procedural work took 6 weeks. Priya filed a civil complaint in Dutchess County Supreme Court in mid-November, case number 2019 worth of documentation attached as exhibits, the 4 wire transfers totaling $4,000, the falsified discharge summary compared against my authentic hospital record, the paternity exclusion from Dutchess Diagnostics, and a sworn affidavit from Teresa Vance herself, who, once she understood the legal exposure she faced for participating in a forged medical document, agreed to cooperate, rather than face separate liability. Her affidavit stated plainly that Diane Doyle had approached her in March of 2019, offered ongoing payment in exchange for being available to say what I'm told, when I'm told, and had personally supplied the altered date and near-match name used on Eli's paperwork, obtained, Teresa said, from a records clerk my mother knew through the dental practice. Detective Marissa Ruiz from the Dutchess County Sheriff's Office was assigned to the forgery inquiry after the DA's office reviewed Priya's referral. I met with Detective Ruiz twice, once at her office on Route 44 and once by phone, and she was careful in a way that made me trust her. She asked for original documents, not photocopies, and she cross-referenced the hospital's internal access logs herself rather than taking Teresa's account at face value. In early December, she confirmed that a records request under my name had in fact been accessed on October 14, 2019, by an employee named Sharon Kell, who turned out to be a longtime family friend of my mother's from church, employed in medical records administration at Vassar Brothers. Sharon was interviewed separately and admitted, according to Detective Ruiz, that she had pulled and altered a blank discharge template as a favor, believing at the time it was for a school project of Diane's, not understanding, or claiming not to understand, what it would ultimately be used for. That detail mattered legally, because it established that the forged document hadn't been improvised in a moment of panic. It had been manufactured months in advance, deliberately, using an inside connection, and set aside like a tool waiting for the right night to be used. By mid-December, I had a folder of my own, considerably thicker than the one Teresa Vance had slid across a rehearsal dinner table. I had Walter's investigative report. I had Detective Ruiz's preliminary findings. I had Teresa's sworn affidavit. I had the wire transfer records. I had the authentic hospital record from October 8, 2019, sitting beside the forged one from October 14, showing two dates 6 days apart telling two entirely different stories. I sent Marcus a message on December 18. I didn't explain anything over text. I asked only if he would sit down with me, in person, with his parents present if he wanted them there, and let me show him everything, in order, without interruption. He didn't answer for 2 days. When he finally did, his message was 4 words long: bring everything. I'll listen. I chose the location carefully and deliberately, and not for drama. I asked if we could meet at his parents' house in Kingston rather than mine, because I wanted Carol and Richard Hale to hear it directly from documents, not filtered later through Marcus's memory of a conversation. I also, separately, sent my mother a letter through Priya's office informing her that a civil complaint had been filed and that she would be formally served within the week. I did not call her myself. I had nothing left to say to her that hadn't already been said in 4 $1,000 payments and 1 forged piece of paper with the wrong date on it. I arrived at the Hales' house on Wappingers Falls Road on a Saturday afternoon in early January, carrying a banker's box instead of a purse, and I remember the smell before anything else: wood smoke from their fireplace, and coffee Carol had made that nobody drank. Marcus opened the door himself. He looked thinner than he had in October, tired around the eyes in a way that made me feel, for one unfair second, guilty for something I hadn't done. Richard and Carol were already seated in the living room. I hadn't asked them to be there, but Marcus had, and I understood why. He didn't want to hear this alone and then have to repeat it to them secondhand. I sat across from all 3 of them at their dining table, laid the folder down, and said, "I'm not going to ask you to just believe me. I'm going to show you, in order, and you can ask questions at any point." I started with the authentic hospital record, October 8, 2019, the corrected negative result, Dr. Anita Cole's name on the follow-up note from February 2020. Carol read it twice before she said anything. Then I laid the forged discharge summary beside it, October 14, the wrong middle initial, the wrong digit in my birth date. 6 days apart, I said. 2 different documents. 1 real. 1 built. Richard asked the question I'd been waiting for. Built by who? I gave them Sharon Kell's name, and the fact that Detective Ruiz had confirmed she'd accessed and altered a blank template from Vassar Brothers' records system. I gave them Teresa Vance's affidavit next, reading the relevant paragraph aloud rather than paraphrasing it, because Priya had told me paraphrasing invites doubt and reading verbatim doesn't. Teresa's sworn statement that Diane Doyle had approached her in March 2019, offered ongoing payment to be available to say what I'm told, when I'm told, and had personally supplied the falsified paperwork. Marcus hadn't said a word yet. He was staring at the wire transfer printout, 4 payments, $1,000 each, my mother's account number redacted by Priya's office but the dates and amounts intact. She paid someone $4,000, he said finally, to hold on to a lie about our future. She paid someone $4,000 over 2 years, I said, to keep a story loaded, in case she ever needed it. I think she needed it the night you found out your parents were planning to help us with a house. Carol's head came up sharply at that. I told them what Todd had told me, the overheard comment in the garage, "Just wait until the dinner, it'll matter more in front of people," the timeline lining up with the June engagement dinner where Richard had mentioned the down payment gift. I watched something shift in Richard's face, not anger exactly, more like recalculation, the look of a man realizing a scene he'd witnessed had been staged for an audience that included him specifically. "So this was never about you," Carol said slowly, looking at me for the first time like she believed it. "This was about her." "I think it was about both of us," I said. "But mostly, yes. I think I was the mechanism. I don't think I was ever the target." Marcus asked to see Detective Ruiz's report next, and I let him read the section on Sharon Kell in full, including her statement that she believed, or claimed to believe, the document was for something harmless. He read it twice, jaw tight, and then set it down and looked at me and asked the only question that actually mattered to him. "Why didn't you tell me any of this back in October, right when it happened?" "Because in October," I said, "I didn't have any of this yet. I had a folder full of accusations and no idea if my own mother had built them. It took me until now to have something I could actually hand you instead of just asking you to trust me on faith again." He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something that I think was the truest thing anyone said in that entire house that day. "I don't think I ever needed proof that you didn't have a secret child, Rachel. I think I needed proof that if something like this ever happened again, you'd bring me the real thing instead of trying to handle it alone." I told him he was right to need that. I told him I'd spent my whole life being praised for handling things myself, and that the praise had taught me the wrong lesson, that asking for help, even from the person I loved, was a kind of failure. Sitting in his parents' dining room with a banker's box of legal documents between us, I said, out loud, for the first time, that I didn't want to be someone who handled things anymore. I wanted to be someone who let people in before the fire got that big. Carol reached across the table then and put her hand over mine, briefly, and said only, "I'm sorry we let you stand there alone that night. We should have asked more questions before we assumed anything." Richard nodded once, which from him, I would learn later, was the equivalent of a long apology. Marcus didn't propose the wedding back on immediately. He asked for 2 weeks, which I gave him without argument, because I understood by then that trust wasn't something I could hand him in a folder alongside the paternity results. It had to be rebuilt in ordinary time, the same slow way everything true gets rebuilt. While Marcus took his 2 weeks, my mother was formally served with the civil complaint on January 9th, at the house on Fairview Terrace, by a process server Priya's office contracted named Donald Reyes. My father called me that same evening, the first time he'd called me directly since the rehearsal dinner, and he didn't apologize either, not really. He said, "Your mother wants to talk to you before this goes any further," which told me everything about where his loyalty still sat, even now. I agreed to one meeting, at Priya's suggestion, with Priya present, recorded with both parties' knowledge under New York's one-party consent law, which meant Priya's own consent was sufficient, though she informed my mother anyway as a courtesy. We met in Priya's conference room on January 14th. My mother arrived without my father. She looked smaller than I remembered, though I think that was less about her actual size and more about the fact that, for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to look directly at her. She opened by telling me the lawsuit was an overreaction and that family doesn't sue family. I told her that family doesn't forge medical documents and pay a woman to publicly humiliate their daughter 3 days before her wedding either, and that if she wanted to talk about what was appropriate between family members, we could start there. She tried a different approach next, the one I recognized from childhood, the reframing. She said she'd only ever wanted to protect the family's reputation, that Todd's debt and the comparison to the Hales' money had frightened her, and that things had gotten out of hand in ways she hadn't intended. I asked her directly whether 4 separate $1,000 wire transfers over 2 years sounded like something that had gotten out of hand, or something that had been planned with intention from the beginning. She didn't answer that. She looked at Priya instead, as if hoping a lawyer in the room might rescue her from her own daughter's question, and Priya said nothing at all, which I think unsettled her more than any accusation could have. Priya laid out, calmly, what the civil complaint sought, a public retraction acknowledging the fabricated claim, compensation for demonstrable damages including the cost of the cancelled wedding venue deposit of $6,200 and vendor cancellation fees totaling just under $3,000, and a formal, written admission that could be shared with the Hale family and anyone else who had witnessed the rehearsal dinner accusation. Priya was also clear, separately, that the criminal referral regarding the forged hospital document was proceeding independently through the district attorney's office and was outside what either of us could negotiate. My mother's face changed when she heard that last part. I think, until that meeting, she had believed the worst consequence she faced was an uncomfortable conversation with me. She hadn't understood that Sharon Kell's admission to Detective Ruiz had opened a criminal exposure that no apology to me could undo. She asked, quietly, whether I could ask them to go easier on Sharon, since Sharon was an old friend just trying to help. I told her that Sharon had altered a hospital document using her position at a medical records office, and that whatever kindness had once existed between them didn't erase what had actually happened, and that it wasn't within my power to intervene in a criminal matter even if I wanted to, which I didn't. Then I asked her the question I'd been carrying since November, since Walter's report, since the line Teresa had repeated to him, that I would forgive my mother eventually, because I always did. I asked her plainly, did she build this entire plan believing that no matter how bad it got, I would eventually just absorb it and move on, the way I always had? She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, she said, I thought you were strong enough to handle it, Rachel. You always have been. I told her that wasn't a compliment anymore. I told her that handling it had never meant strength, it had meant that she never had to face the consequences of what she did to me, because I would quietly clean it up every time. I told her this was the last time. She left Priya's office that day without an apology that meant anything to me. What she left with instead was a formal notice that the civil case would proceed to mediation within 30 days, and a private understanding, I think, for the first time in her life, that I wasn't going to quietly absorb this one. 2 weeks later, on January 28, the Dutchess County District Attorney's Office announced that Sharon Kell would be charged with falsifying business records in the second degree, a Class A misdemeanor under New York law, tied specifically to the altered hospital template. My mother, Diane Doyle, was named as a co-conspirator in the same filing, facing an additional charge of falsifying business records in connection with financing and directing the forged documents' creation. Neither charge, Priya explained, guaranteed jail time, but both carried the weight of a permanent criminal record, and both would require my mother to appear in court, in public, to answer for exactly what she'd done. The mediation happened on February 19, in a conference room at the Dutchess County Courthouse Annex on Market Street, and it wasn't dramatic the way I think some part of me had braced for. It was quiet, procedural, almost anticlimactic, which Priya told me beforehand was usually a good sign. Dramatic mediations tend to mean nobody's actually ready to settle. My mother arrived with her own attorney this time, a man named Frank Delgado, who spent the first 20 minutes trying to argue that the wedding cancellation costs weren't directly attributable to her actions, only to Teresa Vance's public statement, as though the two could be separated. Priya responded by entering Teresa's sworn affidavit into the record again, the paragraph naming my mother as the one who'd supplied the falsified paperwork and directed the timing, and Frank Delgado didn't push that argument a second time. By early afternoon, we had a signed agreement. My mother agreed to pay restitution of $9,200, covering the venue deposit and vendor cancellation fees in full. She agreed to a written statement, drafted with Priya's input and reviewed by Frank Delgado, formally acknowledging that the claim made at the rehearsal dinner regarding a child was false, that she had orchestrated its presentation, and that I had never been pregnant, had never given up a child, and had no biological connection to Eli Vance. That statement was sent directly to every immediate family member who had been present that night, including Carol and Richard Hale, at my specific request, so that the retraction reached the same people who had witnessed the accusation. The criminal case moved on a separate, slower timeline. Sharon Kell pleaded guilty in April to falsifying business records in the second degree and received a conditional discharge along with 100 hours of community service, and lost her position at Vassar Brothers Medical Center as a direct result of the internal investigation that followed her admission. My mother's case took longer. In June, she pleaded guilty to a reduced charge, avoiding trial, and was sentenced to 3 years of probation, a fine of $2,500 payable to the county, and mandated participation in a court-ordered accountability program for first-time offenders, which required, among other things, a written impact statement acknowledging the harm caused, filed with the court. My father's role in all of it stayed murky, and honestly, it stayed murky in my own head too. He was never charged with anything, because there was no evidence he'd known about the forged document or the payments to Teresa in advance. But he had sat at that rehearsal dinner and said nothing, and he had never once, in the months that followed, asked me directly whether I was okay. When I confronted him about it in March, over coffee at the Beacon Diner, the same booth where Todd had first told me about the debt and the down payment, my father said only, "I didn't know how to go against your mother in front of that many people." I told him that not knowing how wasn't the same as trying, and he had no answer for that, and we sat there in silence for a while, and I think that silence told me more honestly where we stood than any apology could have. Todd, for his part, testified voluntarily during the accountability program's review process, corroborating the timeline he'd given me at the diner, and afterward he told me he felt sick about how long he'd gone without saying anything. I didn't blame him the way I might have once. He'd been 24 years old, in debt, dependent on our mother's help, and caught in the same current I'd spent my whole life swimming against. I told him the difference between us was that he eventually told the truth, and my mother never had, and that mattered. By late June, the financial and legal reckoning was mostly finished. $9,200 in restitution paid. A written, distributed retraction. A guilty plea and probation for my mother. A guilty plea and community service for Sharon Kell. Teresa Vance, who cooperated fully once her own legal exposure became clear, avoided charges herself, in part because Priya and the DA's office agreed her role had been financially coerced rather than independently malicious, though she was required to submit a formal statement for the record acknowledging her participation. What none of that restitution or paperwork could touch, though, was the actual shape of my family afterward. My mother and I did not reconcile that summer. We didn't speak at all, in fact, for nearly 5 months. The silence wasn't punishment, not exactly. It was just the natural distance between two people who had, for the first time, stopped pretending the relationship had ever been what it looked like from the outside. Marcus and I got married the following April, 13 months after the rehearsal dinner that had almost ended everything, in a small ceremony at a restored barn venue outside Rhinebeck, 41 guests instead of the original 92, because by then we both understood that smaller and truer mattered more to us than the version we'd originally planned to perform for an audience. My father walked me down the aisle. My mother was not there. That wasn't a punishment either, by that point, it was simply where things had settled, honestly, without theater. The morning of the wedding, I stood in the small dressing room off the barn's main hall, and Carol Hale, my mother-in-law now, helped me with the clasp on a necklace Marcus had given me the night before, and she said something I've thought about often since. She said, "The version of you I met at that rehearsal dinner wasn't the truth. This is." I didn't have a clean response to that in the moment. I just held her hand for a second longer than either of us expected, and we didn't say anything else about it. I want to be honest about something, because I think stories like mine get flattened too easily into clean forgiveness, and mine wasn't clean. In September, 5 months after the wedding, my mother reached out through a letter, not a phone call, handwritten, 3 pages, delivered to my apartment. It wasn't a perfect apology. Parts of it still defended her original reasoning, still framed some of what she'd done as protective rather than destructive, and I noticed that immediately, and it frustrated me. But underneath the parts one disagreed with, there was one paragraph that felt real to me, where she wrote that she had spent so many years managing how the family looked to other people that she'd stopped noticing what she was doing to the people inside it, and that she understood now, having gone through probation and the accountability program, that noticing had come too late to undo the damage, only in time to name it. I didn't respond right away. I sat with that letter for almost 3 weeks before I decided what I wanted to do with it, and what I decided was this: I would allow occasional, limited contact, a phone call every few months, nothing more, no holidays yet, no unsupervised time alone with the version of trust she used to assume she was owed. I told her clearly, in a letter of my own, that this wasn't reconciliation in the way she probably wanted it to be. It was a trial period, and it would only continue if it stayed honest. She has kept to that so far. It's been 8 months now. We talk maybe once every 6 or 7 weeks, brief calls, nothing performative. She asked recently about Marcus's work, about the apartment we're renovating in Kingston, small ordinary questions, and I answered them the same way, small and ordinary, And neither of us reached for more than that, because I think we both understand, finally, that more has to be earned back slowly, in actual time, not declared into existence because enough time has technically passed. Todd and I are closer now than we've ever been, which surprised me more than almost anything else that came out of that year. He finished paying down about half of his debt on his own, without our parents' help this time, working extra shifts at an auto shop in New Paltz, and he calls me now just to talk, not because something's wrong. Last month he asked if he could bring his girlfriend to Thanksgiving at my place instead of our parents' house, and I said yes without hesitating. My father and I are still working out what our relationship actually is, underneath all the years I spent assuming it was something solid. He goes to therapy now, which he never would have considered before any of this, and he's told me, in his own quiet way, that he understands now that staying silent at that rehearsal dinner was its own kind of choice, not a neutral one. We're not close in the way I once wished we were. But we're honest, which is new, and which matters more than I expected it to. Marcus and I talk about that year sometimes, usually late at night, usually without any particular reason for bringing it up. He told me once that the thing that stayed with him longest wasn't the accusation itself, or even the folder Teresa left behind, it was watching me build a case, methodically, evidence by evidence, instead of collapsing or lashing out, and that it taught him something about who he'd actually married that he might never have learned any other way. I told him I wished I hadn't needed to learn it that way either. I think about forgiveness differently now than I did before any of this happened. I used to think forgiveness was a single decision, a door you either opened all the way or kept shut. I don't think that anymore. Forgiveness, I've learned, can be partial and provisional and still be real. Forgiveness is personal, but access must be earned, and those are two entirely different things, and confusing them is what almost cost me everything I actually wanted. There's a specific memory I keep returning to, more than any courtroom filing or wire transfer record, more than the sound of that wine glass cracking against the table runner. It's small, and it happened almost a year after everything settled, on an ordinary Tuesday evening in our apartment in Kingston, nothing dramatic about it at all. Marcus was making dinner, something simple, pasta with the kind of Jared sauce we both pretended we'd dress up with real herbs and never actually did, and my phone rang, and it was my mother, right on schedule for one of our brief calls. I answered it standing at the kitchen counter, and she asked how the renovation on the second bedroom was going, and I told her about the paint color we'd finally settled on, a pale sage green, and she asked a few normal follow-up questions, and we hung up after maybe 11 minutes. Marcus glanced over from the stove and asked how it went, the way he always does now, gently, without pressure, and I said, fine. Normal, and I remember feeling something in my chest that I didn't immediately recognize, because it had been so long since a conversation with her had felt merely fine and normal instead of loaded with something underneath. That's what healing actually looked like for me, in the end. Not a dramatic reunion. Not a tearful scene where everyone cried and understood everything at once. Just an 11-minute phone call about paint color, landing softly instead of landing like a threat. I still keep the smell of rosemary in my head sometimes. Oddly enough, it was the rosemary chicken being plated the night everything broke open at that rehearsal dinner, and for almost a year afterward, the smell of rosemary in any kitchen would put my whole body on alert, waiting for something to go wrong. It doesn't do that anymore. Last month I made rosemary chicken myself, in our own kitchen, on a completely unremarkable Sunday, and it was just dinner. That, more than any legal filing, is how I know time actually did its work. I don't know if my mother and I will ever be what people picture when they picture a mother and a daughter. I've made peace with the possibility that we won't. What I've come to believe, slowly, and without much certainty even now, is that you can love someone and still limit what you give them access to, and that those two things are not contradictions, they're actually the only honest way to hold both truths at once. I loved my mother the entire time she was doing this to me. I still do. And loving her didn't obligate me to hand her back the same unguarded trust she'd spent years proving she wasn't safe to hold. I think about Teresa Vance sometimes too, and Eli, who's 8 years old now and had absolutely nothing to do with any of this, a child used as a prop in an adult's plan he'll probably never fully understand. I hope, wherever he is, that whatever story his mother eventually tells him about that year leaves out the parts that would only hurt him for no reason. He didn't choose any of it. None of us really choose the roles we get handed in someone else's plan. What we choose is what we do once we understand the plan was never really about us at all. So here's what I keep asking myself, even now, on ordinary Tuesdays with pasta on the stove and paint swatches taped to a half-finished wall. If the people who are supposed to protect you the most turn out to be the ones building the case against you in the dark, quietly, for years, waiting for the moment it will do the most damage, how do you learn to trust again, not blindly, but carefully, on your own terms, at your own pace, without losing the part of yourself that still wants to believe people can change? I still don't have a clean answer to that. I'm not sure anyone does. I think the honest answer is that you don't fully solve it. You just keep choosing, call by call, ordinary evening by ordinary evening, how much access someone gets back, and you stay willing to revise that decision as new evidence comes in. The same way I once sat across from a lawyer with a folder of documents and let the facts, not my fear, decide what came next. So let me ask you the same question I still ask myself. If someone you loved spent years quietly building a story designed to destroy you the moment it would hurt the most, would you know how to tell the difference between forgiving them and simply letting them back in? Thank you so much for watching this story all the way through. Everything in this video is fictional, made only for entertainment and reflection, and none of the names, places, or events depict any real people or real events. If there's one thing worth carrying out of a story like this, it's that healing rarely arrives as one dramatic moment, it arrives slowly, in ordinary conversations, once you've learned that setting a boundary and still loving someone were never opposites to begin with.